This just in, breaking news from Stronghold Games. The world has been hit with mega earthquakes. The worst destruction has devastated the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome to the How to Play video for Aftershock, where you will help to rebuild San Francisco to restore it to its former glory. Before we dive into how to play, let's start with how to set up the game. Begin by placing the game board in the middle of the table. Then give each player at the table a player screen, a clip, and a planning board. Each player should place their clip on their player screen to 0. Additionally, each player receives a matching set of meeples, houses, bridges, and buy tokens for their personal supply. Each player should also receive score markers based on the number of players. Return any leftover score markers to the box as they will not be needed. Each player now places their buy tokens face up in front of their planning boards with the -2, -1, and +1 million tax showing. Each player should place 1 meeple on the 0 space of the score track. Give each player a 5 million and 10 of the 1 million coin tokens. Place any remaining coin tokens back in the box. Give each player a bridge card and shuffle the remaining cards. Deal each player at the table 7 so that each starts with a hand of 8 cards. The remaining deck is placed back next to the board. Be sure to leave room for a discard pile. Place the Aftershock die, Aftershock markers, and influence markers near the game board in a common supply. The youngest player at the table receives the first player token. You are now set up and ready to play Aftershock, but before you do, we should first learn how to play the game. Aftershock is played in rounds, with each round being made up of 4 distinct phases: acquire cards, populate and plan, resolution, and finally scoring. The number of rounds is dependent on the number of players at the table. With 3 and 4 players, the game consists of 3 rounds, and if playing with 5, then the game lasts for 2 rounds. The player at the end of the game with the most points is the winner. Before we dive into the phases, let's first examine the anatomy of the cards within Aftershock. There are 4 different cards within Aftershock: Area, Bridge, Aftershock, and Influence cards. Area cards are used to place meeples on the corresponding area of the game board during the populate phase of the game. There are 4 parts to area cards: the name, which shows the area on the board where the meeple may be placed; cost, which shows the amount of coins required to purchase the card; meeples, showing the number of meeples to place in the area; and finally area, which serves as a reminder where this area can be found on the game board. Aftershock, Bridge, and Influence cards share a common anatomy and are each used to gain components. These cards also have 4 parts: the type, showing whether the card is Aftershock, Bridge, or Influence; cost, which like area cards shows the amount of coin needed to buy the card; reward, this tells what components are gained when the card is played; and finally explanation, which identifies when the gained components are used. With that out of the way, let's dive into how to play. Phase 1, the acquire phase, is made up of 3 parts. First, players look at the 8 cards in their hand and decide which, if any, they wish to purchase. Any cards the player chooses to not buy are placed face down in front of their player screen. The cards they choose to keep must be bought and paid for. Reveal these cards to the player to the left of the table and pay the sum of the cost to the bank. Players then place these cards face down behind their player screen. Note, players should not reveal and pay for their cards until all other players at the table have selected the cards they wish to buy. After all players have paid for the cards they wish to keep, then all cards that were not chosen are flipped face up in front of their player screens so that all players at the table can see them. Next, starting with the first player, each player may use a buy token to buy a card that is available or pass. A player may not buy a card from the cards in front of their own screen. A buy token must be used in order to purchase a card. There are 3 types. The -1 and -2 million tokens allow a player to pay this amount less than the listed buy price, but the tokens are flipped over after use. The +1 million token allows a player to purchase a card, but they must first pay a 1 million tax to the bank before paying the card's cost. This token is not flipped over. When purchasing another player's card, the amount is paid to the player that placed the card up for sale. Buying continues until all players of the table pass consecutively, so it is possible to pass and buy a card next time. Finally, each player selects one card from the unbought cards they placed for sale for free, placing this card behind their screen with their other cards. If a player has no cards left in front of their screen, then they do not receive a free card in this step. Any remaining unpurchased cards are placed in the discard pile. Phase 2 is the populate and planning phase. This phase is made up of 3 steps: populate, play cards, and planning. For the populate step, all players simultaneously place meeples and houses on the game board for all of the area cards they have. After all meeples and houses have been placed, these cards are put into the discard pile. An important note here is that 1 house is equal to 3 meeples when placing, so a player may choose to place a house instead of 3 meeples onto the game board. Next, each player reveals all of the remaining cards in their hand. For each bridge card revealed, they gain and place 1 bridge and 1 meeple of their color behind their player screen. For each Aftershock card revealed, they gain and place the corresponding Aftershock marker behind their screen. For each influence card revealed, the player gains and places 1 influence marker behind their screen. Players now discard all of their revealed cards. Finally in this phase is the planning step. In the planning step, players place out the bridges, meeples, and Aftershock markers that they gained in the previous step onto their planning board. Bridges and meeples gained from a bridge card can be placed on different areas of the planning board. Players can place more than 1 Aftershock marker in the same area. Placing these bridges, meeples, and Aftershock markers will determine where these are built and resolved in the next phase. Note that players do not place influence markers and do not place anything in the most bridges area of the planning board. The importance of how to place in this step will become apparent when we cover the next phase of the game. After all players have placed their bridges, meeples, and Aftershock markers, the game is ready to move on to the next phase. The resolution phase is made of 2 steps: building bridges and placing meeples, and the Aftershock step. Starting with the first player and proceeding clockwise around the table, players take turns removing their player screens and placing their bridges and meeples out onto the board if they have them. To build bridges, a player places 1 bridge piece in each section of the bridge area leading from one area to the next. The bridge must be built in a vacant bridge space leading from the area selected on the planning board. A player may only build a bridge if they have the number of pieces to do so, as bridges may not be partially built. They may, if they wish, dismantle a previously built bridge on the board and use some or all of these pieces to build the new bridge. In the event a player cannot build in the chosen area due to there being no vacant spaces, they instead place a meeple into the area. Meeples must be placed in the area of the game board that was chosen on the planning board. After all players have placed out their bridges and meeples, Aftershocks are resolved. Starting with the first player, and again going clockwise around the table, each player who has 1 or more Aftershock markers resolves them. Aftershocks cause meeples in the area chosen on the planning board to become shocked, forcing them to leave the area. If a player has more than 1 Aftershock marker, they may resolve them in any order, but must resolve all of their markers before play passes to the next player. To resolve an Aftershock, the player rolls the Aftershock die. For a normal Aftershock, the number of meeples shocked is equal to the die roll. For a big Aftershock, it is the number rolled plus 1. And for a mega Aftershock, meeples are shocked equal to the number rolled plus 2. The player resolving chooses which meeples in the area are shocked. They must shock the number of meeples from the Aftershock if there are enough, even if this means they shock their own. When a meeple is shocked, the player who controls the meeple chooses whether to move the meeple to another area or remove it from the game board. This is resolved clockwise, starting with the player to the left of the active player. To move a meeple, the player may move them across a bridge they own for free to an adjacent area. The meeple may even be moved across multiple bridges farther away from the starting point. They may also choose to use another player's bridge. When using another player's bridge, the player pays the owner of the bridge 1 million per bridge for each meeple moved. These options may be combined in a single movement as well. If the player cannot or does not wish to move the meeple, then that meeple is removed from the board. After all Aftershocks have been resolved, it is time to move to the next phase. Phase 4 is the scoring phase. This phase is made up of 2 parts, placing scoring markers and scoring points. Players now determine which areas of the game board they would like to score. To do so, players place their scoring markers on areas of their planning board behind their player screen that correspond with those areas they wish to score. A player may not place more than one scoring marker on an area, and they must place all of their scoring markers. Players are also free to negotiate and make agreements with other players at the table to place scoring markers in the same area. However, these agreements are not binding. Influence markers gained earlier are used during this step as well. These markers act as scoring markers, except that they may be placed in the same space as a scoring marker if the player wishes, ensuring that area will score. After all players have placed their scoring and influence markers on their planning boards, the player screens are removed. Starting with the top row and moving left to right, players check if an area will score. An area scores if it has at least 2 scoring markers on it between all of the players at the table. After scoring the top row, proceed the same way with the bottom row, and then finally with the most bridges space. Any area with 1 or 0 markers does not score this round. When an area scores, players score points based upon how many meeples they have present in the area and advance their meeple on the score track. This is a good time to remind players that houses count the same as 3 meeples. The player with the highest number of meeples in the area scores the highest value printed on that area. The second highest scores the second highest value, and so on. If players are tied, they split the points for the tied positions rounded down. The player or players who score the highest number of points in an area remove one of their meeples from that area and return it to their supply. For the most bridges, the player with the most bridges out on the board scores the highest points, and so on, just like areas. Unlike areas, however, players do not remove bridges from the board. After scoring is complete, it's time for end of round cleanup, unless this was the final round. If this was not the final round, then complete the following steps. At the end of the round, collect all of the cards up and shuffle. Deal each player 8 new cards. Evenly distribute, as best as possible, all of the coins in the bank. Any coins left over are left in the bank. Players reset their buy tokens. Return all Aftershock and influence markers to the supply. The first player token is passed to the player to the left, unless this is a 5-player game where it is passed to the player second to the left. The player with the lowest score receives the free Aftershock marker. This marker is resolved in the next round the same way as a regular Aftershock marker. If this was the final round of the game, then instead each player receives 1 point for every 2 million in coins they have left. The player with the most points is the winner. In the event of a tie, the player with the most money left over wins. If still tied, the player furthest from the first player token wins. This concludes the how to play for Aftershock. I hope you have found this video informative and you are now ready to play your first game. As this video was produced during the game's crowdfunding period, some rules and artwork may have changed. Always refer to your most recent rulebook for any changes. Thank you for watching.